Alright, peace and greetings, YouTubers. So, standardized testing and why I'm not a big fan. Let's just jump right into it. Now, if you follow me, I think I made like a Your Questions, My Answers video maybe a year or two ago, and I somehow got on the subject of standardized testing, and I said I would come back and do another video on it, and a lot of you have held me to that. So I'm here to do the video. My bad for it taking forever to get to it. But anyway, let's just jump right into it. Now, there's two main reasons why I'm not a fan of standardized testing. One, obviously because of its racist origins, which I will get into. That's going to pretty much be the bread and butter of this video. But two, I'm also just not a fan of putting people in a box and expecting them all to perform the same way. And when I think of intelligence, I look at intelligence as something that has so many layers, and there's not one specific way to measure intelligence. However, these standardized tests, they do exactly that. And somehow they expect, you know, a planet of 7 billion people to all operate and base their intelligence off this specific test, or they're not considered intelligent if they don't meet that standard. And so I've just never been a fan. And to be honest, I'm also not a fan of how we currently are doing our K-12 education in this country. So when you mix that combination of standardized testing that these kids have to take in order to, in some states, progress to the next grade, and for most going to college in order to go to college, when you're looking at the SAT or some of the state and local tests that students have to take in order to graduate or go to the next grade, you know, there's just a lot of holes in how they operate, and there's a lot of flaws. And I always tell the kids that I work with, I've worked with kids, and I've been doing that for like 7 years working in the after-school realm. I always tell my kids, like, I want them to be the best that they can be. I want them to get good grades. I want them to do well on those tests. But those tests and those grades don't define them. I always tell them that grades are important, but grades just mean, especially in K-12, that you just know how to regurgitate what's already been told to you. You know what I mean? Like, getting good grades in K-12, in my opinion, just means that you were able to master the system that you were put in. And I tell my kids, that's what you want to be able to do. You want to be able to master any environment that you're put in. You want to be able to figure out a system that you're in and figure out how to master it so you can be the person who calls the shots. So I always tell them that grades do not define who they are, but how they process information and how they relay that information, how they're able to share what they've learned, and how they're able to utilize resources to become, you know, better people and utilize those resources to make their experience on this planet better. That's how they can measure their own intelligence, and that's what would define them, because people have so many different gifts and talents. And when you limit what people are able to do based on something like a test, because you have to also think a standardized test opens many doors and closes many doors for others. When you're talking about college acceptance, or even for jobs, when you have like a battery test, it can be the same way. And so I always tell my kids, like, I want you to get really, really good grades. I want you to be the best you can be, but it doesn't define you at the same time. I want you to go above and beyond, because I always said, like, as I said, getting good grades just means you've mastered the system. You've been given a deck of cards and you've figured out how to strategize and win that game. However, life is a bunch of different games. It's not just one. And so just like when you look at something like games, some people are super, super good at something like spades but might suck at Monopoly. They might be really good at dodgeball and suck at golf. They might suck at golf, but they might be really, really good at chess. Like, there's a bunch of different games, and I think that's the perfect symbolism of how people in this world operate. If you have a planet of 7 billion people and you have all these different kind of games that people play, people are going to shine where they're in their element. But for some reason, somebody decided to create an element and make that the standard that people abide by. And that's pretty much standardized testing. So let's jump into it. Sorry for that mini rant. I felt it in my spirit. I was about to really go in. So you have Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin is the person who initially starts the whole idea of, okay, humans came from monkeys. Okay, cool, Charles, I guess, yeah, whatever. And so he started that theory, but then it evolved into, wait a minute, hold up, I spoke too soon. Really what it is, you know, humans evolved from monkeys, but us white people, we did it a little bit better than you guys, and we have fully evolved, and we are now this perfect utopian being that is just this ball of intelligence. And all the other races are just not quite there. You know, black people, they got about 30,000 more years of evolution before they can catch up to us, and this, that, and the third. And so that kind of idea led into the idea of eugenics. And all this tied into white superiority. This was a time period where people really believed that intelligence was based upon race and based upon what you were born into. Intelligence was something that was inherited and it could not change. Once you were born into something, that's just all you were ever going to be. So it's kind of like looking at elephants and how it's physically impossible for elephants to jump straight up in the air with 4 knees. That's how people looked at intelligence. At the time, when people were doing these different studies and everything, it was impossible for people's intelligence to change or alter. It was pretty much, you were born into whatever you were born in, that's who you were going to be. And so this led into the idea of eugenics. And eugenics was something that basically used the idea of white superiority as the law and the justifying reasons to create a social order in which white people were going to be the ones in charge, specifically elite and rich white people. On top of that, because poor white people, they were almost at the bottom of the barrel with black folks, but of course the element of whiteness protected them from not being black. So that was pretty much how things operated. And so you had 4 people that you needed to get familiar with, all right? So you had Lewis Terman, you had Robert Yerkes, you had Carl Brigham, and you had Alfred Bennett, all right? Now, these names are important for various reasons, because these are the people that really took this whole eugenics thing and ran with it, and that's pretty much the origins of why we have a lot of what we have today. So when you look at this whole superiority complex, first, can we get into Robert Yerkes? I'm going to skip Lewis Terman because, yeah, whatever, just look him up. But Robert Yerkes, he's the person who came up with the Army Intelligence Test. And with this test, he came up with 3 conclusions. One conclusion was that at the time, and this was, I believe, 1917, at the time, white people were becoming less intelligent. And he believed that this was because the elite and the white people who were super intelligent were spending too much time around the poor white people and white people who were less intelligent and feeble-minded, and too much time around black people and everything like that. And he feared that because of that, the world was going to soon collapse, and something needed to be done. So that test was something that was created to kind of almost scare people and to recognize, oh my God, we need to give all of our energy and our effort and power to, you know, these white people in power that are going to be able to save the world, which I'm going to get to in a second. The second thing he concluded was that, which I found funny because this is how white superiority can work when it's even against them and their own people. He did a study on Europe, and he came with the conclusion that Northern Europeans were more intelligent than Southern Europeans. And in order for that to make sense, you have to look at the phenotypes of the people in that region, all right? And we're going to have to do a quick history lesson. So let's backtrack to the 7th century. 7th century, what happens to Europe? All right, you had the African Moors coming to Europe, coming in through Spain and working their way through the southern portions, all right? And what they did, they came and they helped to come and civilize parts of Europe and teach, you know, different mathematics and sciences and hygiene and stuff like that. And of course, hey, some people fell in love, some people made babies and everything like that. And so you fast forward a few more centuries, now you have places in Southern Europe where the phenotypes are a little different for 2 reasons. One, because of just the location to the equator, and 2, because some of these people living in Southern Europe have a few more extra little tricks and treats in their bloodlines other than white people. And so when you look at Southern Europe, a lot of the places in Southern Europe, Spain, Portugal, the Azores, Italy, the people in that region have a more olive skin, like an olive tone skin. Like there's a little bit more of a tan. You know, they have a little bit more pigmentation in their skin. So they come off with a hint, just a hint of brown in them, some of them, not all of them. And when you look at Northern Europe, places like Denmark and the Netherlands and Norway and Sweden and Brussels or Belgium, you know, the people there don't have as much pigmentation. They're a little bit more pale. And I'm not trying to insult anybody, but they're a little bit more pale than the others. And so remember that. Now, he did this research, and he came up with the conclusion that people up north were smarter than those down south. And that ties specifically to the fact that the people down south might have had a chance that they might just have had a little bit of black in them. All right, so automatically, we got to make them look a little less intelligent. You know what I mean? And then the third thing he came up with was that, of course, black people were the bottom of the barrel. We were just absolute idiots. We just couldn't do anything, and we were inferior. And so that study alone created the ideology, like I said, that people have to pretty much do something. He created fear in people because people felt that, oh my goodness, if we don't do something, black people and everybody else, they're going to bring this entire world down, and the white race is doomed, and the whole planet, we're just going to all fall apart and die. All right, so that was Robert Yerkes. All right, then you had Carl Brigham, and Carl Brigham is a person who sat on the college board and created the SAT. Yes, he's the one who created that. All right, and then you also had Alfred Bennett, who created the IQ test. So, with these different exams and everything, and this is around between the 1910s and the 1920s, there's all kind of little bits of elements of research that came out. And what that did was, it created this lane where people wanted to make restrictions for people who were not intelligent. And the idea with eugenics was, they were going to take the people who would take these different tests, and those who like scored the highest, like they're just super high. The plan was, let's get those people to constantly breed and reproduce so that they make this generation of just really important, smart beings who are just so intelligent, and so their cognitive dissonance is just, they're just on it. All right, they want to get that group of people and that demographic to consistently breed and do all these different things. And that group of people will get all the resources and opportunities, and eventually, because they would continue to overpopulate the earth, the inferior people like the blacks and the poor whites and people who were from Southern Europe and the Asians at the time and everybody in that region, you know, that demographic would eventually die off because they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves, because if they didn't even have the opportunity to mate and reproduce with these smarter people, they would only reproduce with dumb people. And the dumber they got, as they made more, they would just get dumber and dumber, and before you know it, they would be back to Neanderthal state. And you know what happened to them? They're not here anymore. So that was the idea. And so that pretty much created the origin of a lot of things. But then when you talk about the standardized testing, that, like, how do I say this? So you had the Army Intelligence Test, which we're about to get back into, because we're going to talk about a great person named Horace Bond, and he came and shut all that crap down. But anyway, so the idea of the standardized testing, like I said, was to prove that pretty much if you were not this, and you were not wealthy, and you were not elite, you were less than, you were less intelligent. And so that, like I said, that created the SAT, that created the Army Intelligence Test, that created the IQ test. And unfortunately, those same tests are still used today in our schooling. And pretty much it set up the foundation of how our entire education system would operate. Because when you look at education, when you look at something like college, college is something where pretty much they're trying to weed out those who don't qualify to get in, unfortunately. And what that does is it creates an elite class. It creates an elite group of people who have all of these skills and these talents, and for some reason they're just so much more above everybody else. And that's what gets them to, you know, climb the realm of success and everything like that. And so what these tests were supposed to do was to kind of keep certain groups of people out. And so when you look at something like the standardized testing and how they pretty much, people basically at the time assumed that standardized testing measured your intelligence. But really, in reality, standardized testing had nothing to do with intelligence and race. It had more so to do with resources and opportunity, which we're going to get into. So now we have this guy named Horace Bond. And actually, if you're familiar, he's actually Julian Bond's father. Julian Bond was the civil rights leader. Now, Horace Bond was also the president of Lincoln University. And so he went back and he was like, wait, now this is a black man, by the way. He was like, wait a minute, y'all not about to be cooking me and my people like this. I know, let me go back and look at your research. So he went back and looked at the Army Intelligence Test. And he discovered a bunch of things that were not really quite published and a bunch of things that were not publicized. And so what he discovered, and this is when it gets real good. All right. So first of all, he looked at the results of white individuals from states like Mississippi and Arkansas and Georgia, and he actually discovered that they performed lower than blacks who had been living in northern states, which boom, automatically killed the idea of all the, you know, intelligence having anything to do with genetics. And he was able to somehow correlate the idea that having opportunity and resources correlated with how people would process information, which in this day and age was what we measured intelligence by. And so he was able to process that. But let me tell you how petty people used to be. So we fast forward to 1954. What happened? Brown versus Board of Education. And this is the time period where, you know, black people were finally going to be able to sit in the same school with white people, and everything was going to be just fine and dandy like it is now. And anyway, so you had pretty much a bunch of white senators who were livid, like, oh my God, we don't want our kids going to school with them. You know, they're going to ruin everything. You know, especially our poor daughters. They're going to have to, oh my God, those big, giant, 6'5" black boys are going to rape our daughters, and this, that, and the third. And this is really what they were doing. And they wrote this thing called the Southern Manifesto. And it was basically something that literally used that same exact exam, the Army Intelligence Test, and tried to prove that black people were inferior, and black people were dangerous, and black people were this, and black people were that. And so Mr. Bond was like, okay, I got y'all. He went right back, and he wrote this article, and it was called The Intelligence of the Congressmen Who, I gotta remember what the title, I feel like who, oh my God, I forgot the title, who signed the Southern Manifesto, something like based around IQ. Google it, it's on there, I got the title all wrong. But he was able to actually go back and use that same research to test it on those senators who all signed this manifesto that was saying, you know, don't put these black children in our white schools, we need to protect our white babies. He was able to actually scientifically prove that based on the standards of Yerker's Army Intelligence Test, these same senators who sat there and did all this hoopla about whoop-de-whoop-de-woo, I don't want the black kids with my kids because my kids are so intelligent, we're so intelligent, he was able to prove that actually those senators were the bottom 20% of the white demographic when it came to intelligence. And it's so funny because it almost symbolizes our current Congress. I was like, the way things just align. But see, that's where things didn't end, because when it comes to the idea of intelligence, like I said, standardized testing and a lot of these things have been used for years and years to try to prove that black people were idiots or black people weren't intelligent. And so I'm glad that there were more than just one person that continued to fight against this notion. So then you had another guy named Jenkins. And so Jenkins, in 1936, did some research on youth in Illinois. And so he did, pretty much he used them saying, I don't know if it was the Army intelligence test, it might have been an IQ test. It was an IQ test. So he used the IQ test on these members. Now what he did was, he pretty much made sure that the kids, both black and white, had the same opportunities, same resources, came from the same socioeconomic status, came from the same kind of background, had the same education levels, everything like that, made sure that it was fair. And when they took the test, they pretty much scored exactly the same, which again dispelled the idea that black people were inferior to white people. Then there was another guy named Tizard, and he did his research in, I believe, 1972. He did his in 1972 in the Caribbean. Now this ruffles some feathers here because this was on point. So he too did the IQ test, and also going back to Jenkins' exam, what he discovered is people who scored higher than 130 on the IQ test came from equal, like they had, like I said, they had the same equal kind of opportunities, and so he was basically concluding that again, race had nothing to do with intelligence. It was more of a socioeconomic ability and people's experience. And then it kind of ties back to what Bond was saying as far as the experience of blacks in the North in comparison to whites in the South, and how blacks in the North were doing better than poor whites. Again, it's kind of showing that, hey, this isn't really about race. This is about socioeconomics and classism. But anyway, going back to Tizard's research, Tizard basically did the same study, but he changed his. He did his with black students, biracial students, and white students. And so when he did the IQ test, white students scored a 103. The average median score was a 103 for white students. The average median score for biracial students was a 106. The average median score for black students was a 108. All right? And so what always gets me, and this is why I have my 2 cents about standardized testing, with all of this research, because this wasn't it, I'm just scratching like the surface. There's so many people that have done research to kind of refute a lot of the claims about black people being less intelligent or white people being more intelligent than blacks based off, you know, brain capacity. Because in addition, there was more research that showed African immigrants who come to the United States after pretty much going through most of their, you know, K-12 experience over there, when they come here, they outperform white students as well. And again, it kind of kills the idea of black people being inferior. It's clearly showing that there's an element of classism, and when people have opportunities and resources, they can perform just as well. And so what pisses me off about standardized testing is, even with all that research, the original structure of something like an SAT or an IQ test is still the same as it was when it was initially created. And they constantly continue to use that as a way to work against different groups of people while elevating other groups of people. Time out. Alright, now getting back to my point, people like Bond and Jenkins and Tizard, they were able to use their research to dispel and pretty much seam with all the generalizations that were being made about black people at the time, as far as black people not being intelligent based on the fact that they were black. They were able to dispel that and say, no, actually it has more to do with economics and social welfare and education, mental health and everything like that. And that is what was able to determine the intelligence. And unfortunately, because these were black men in the 1920s, they did not have the same power that white people had. So their research kind of got ignored, and people were like, yeah, whatever. Which is why pretty much the setup of standardized testing and the IQ test has not really changed. It has changed a little bit, and I'll get to it in a second. So let's go to the flip side, to the Team Eugenics crew. Alright, so the whole Team Eugenics crew, based on the results of the Army intelligence test, they were able to pass an act. Not that actual crew of 4, but the research that those 4 created, that created what we call the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. And based on the results of the Army intelligence test, saying, you know, Southern Europeans were dumb, it was like, okay, we're going to limit how many Southern Europeans are coming into the country. Because when you look at what was going on in the United States at the time, a whole lot was going on, alright? So one, World War I had already ended in 1918, about, 6 years earlier, and so Europe is a bunch of rubble and everything is tore up over there. Everybody got PTSD and people are sickly and everything, and so a lot of them are getting on the boats and coming straight to the United States, to the point where there are so many immigrants that there's more immigrants than original citizens in the country. It's getting to that point. So if you live, depending on what city you're in, so if you're in a city like New York and you went to school, 3 of the 4 students in your classroom, or every 3 out of 4 students in your classroom, did not even speak English as a first language because they were immigrants. And so a lot of the original white Americans in the country at that time were pissed off, like, oh my God, I'm sick of these Europeans coming in here. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted only the best Europeans to come, which kind of helped to justify this Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. So that happened. But then again, fast forwarding a little bit later, they discovered that they had more power by identifying as white than, categorizing everybody by their nationality. Because this, a little bit around this time, everybody was, it wasn't, I'm white, you're black. Black people were still black and we were N-words and everything else like that. But white people were, I'm Polish, I'm German, I'm French, I'm from Belgium. That was what they were doing. Then they discovered, okay, all these black people are coming in here, they're skilled, they know how to do all these different things, because remember, black people weren't really going to colleges and stuff. You know, HBCUs had finally started, and you know, some black people who could afford it were going to school, but a lot of black people were not educated at the time. A lot of them were still sharecropping, a lot of them were doing jobs that, you know, the average white person wasn't doing, but they were very, very skilled, and they were really, really qualified for a lot of these new industrial jobs that were opening in the country. And white people didn't want to lose those jobs to black people because, listen, there were a lot of black establishments that were popping up full of wealth. So you had like black, you know, Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, even though they burned that down 3 years, you know, earlier. From 1924, they burned that down, but there were all these little pop-ups, and black people were starting to become successful. White people knew, okay, you know what, maybe we should join forces because the element of whiteness will protect us. And so that's when that whole nationalist kind of, you're German, you're this, it turned into we're all white. And that created the formation of unions that black people were not allowed to be a part of. And that's how white people were able to keep their jobs, and the black unemployment rate was so high during that time period. In addition, yeah, all that was going on. I'm going to get back to my point before I go way off the point. But like, so with that being said, you know, had somebody like Julian Bond been petty and had a bit of power, he could have used his research to do exactly what was done to him, but he didn't have that in his heart, because he said, you know, well, based on my research that I was able to do, you know, the same white people who took that same test that y'all just used for that Immigration Act, you know, white individuals from places like Arkansas, Mississippi, and Georgia, when they took that exam or whatever, the results that came, the medial results were showing that, hey, these people were operating with the mental intelligence of a 12-and-a-half-year-old. Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi. What was in common at the time? Those three states were extremely poor as far as the poverty rates in the states. And so it helped to prove again, hey, intelligence has nothing to do with race, but it's more so economics. Now, if he was petty, he could have said, yep, I told y'all white people are stupid. That's what it is. It has nothing to do with black people. Y'all just listen. We need to use this research about these three, and we need to put them in quarantine them. They could have done that if they had the power to do so. But even if they did, they didn't. They worked on their own community and did positive things. See, that's how you use your research to do good, okay? But anyway, be like, what was it? Be like Henry Salk with the cure for polio and give it away for free. But, so that was that. But getting to my main point, they were like, okay, black people, y'all over here outperforming us on stuff. We got y'all, though. Don't worry. We about to get you real good, because there's a thing called linguistics that we know y'all aren't going to get. And that is the one element of something like the SAT that they were able to structurally change and use against groups of color, or people of color. Because one, when you look at linguistics, that's the study of language and everything like that, and language arts, that's really where a lot of black individuals do terrible on something like the SAT. Why? So you go back to the origin of the SAT at that time. A lot of black people couldn't read. Why? Because they weren't allowed to for the last 300-400 years. And then, like I said, a lot of them were not getting the education that they deserved, or that they, you know, really deserved, and everything else like that. And on top of that, the United States is composed of so many groups of people who have different dialects on how they do things. But black individuals, specifically, our dialect is different than how we write. Our vernacular is different than how we write. We do things differently, and as you go to the different regions, it varies as well. But something like the SAT, there's one specific standard for how everything should be written and how everything should be said. And so that was something that was used against black individuals when it came to standardized testing and getting access into colleges and other things like that. They even used that with voting, all right? I wish I could send you guys the link, but you can Google it. Like, take a look at the, I think this is Louisiana. Take a look at the exam that black individuals had to take in order to vote and read that crap. Okay, if you were somebody who didn't have the best education, that crap made no sense. And that's on Google. You can actually look at it. I think it's from 1963. No, it had to be from the 50s. Look it up. It's on Google. But yeah, they use linguistics as a weapon against black people, because it's like, okay, well, we know you guys are not as intelligent on paper because you haven't been given those resources and opportunities. We'll take that away from you. And so that's pretty much what they've done. And you have to look at something like English. English is a very, very difficult language to learn if it's not your first language. And that's more so a pun for people who are coming from outside into this country. Like, our language is very complex because it doesn't make sense phonetically. A lot of our words are not spelled the way that they sound. We have silent letters. We have letters that combine to make a new sound. There's all kinds of things. And then when you get into the grammar, oh my goodness. So the whole argument about him, her, and hers. I'm sorry, his, him, and her. You know, you can get him and say himself, but you can't get his and say hisself, because hisself is technically not formal, it's more so informal. So, you know, it's like you can say her and herself, but when it gets to his, you have to say himself. You don't normally say hisself. So somebody was like, that doesn't make sense. How come there's only one term for the female version of, you know, something being possessive? It's just her and hers. How come you can't say his and himself, or her and herself, and everything. You see how I'm even confused talking about it, but like, think about it. You know what I mean? When you're talking about himself and herself, you have him, her, his. There's no version of his for hers. It's just hers and him. You know what I mean? Like, anyway, getting to my point. So, like I said, English is that confusing. So, black children in this country are taught to write differently than how they speak. And that's a lot, because when you get into the different dialects of how people speak in the vernaculars and the accents, it's very hard to understand certain elements of language when you speak a certain way at home, but then you have to go to school and learn a different way. White kids don't often have that same problem, depending on where they grow up. And so, pretty much that test was created with the purpose of excluding us, because they purposely used the dialect and the vernacular of the elite and the wealthy to be the standard of what speaking good English was in this country. And so things like that affect everybody. So when you're talking about standardized testing, it just goes, and it goes because it all ties into pretty much stripping away the rights from different groups of people. So even redlining, which was, you know, it was discriminatory housing practices that pretty much didn't allow black individuals to live in certain parts of the country or certain cities. You know, all that ties into everything, because the element of redlining came from the idea that black people weren't intelligent enough to live in our neighborhoods, which goes back to old boy's research, where he felt that, oh my God, white people are getting dumb, and we have to not be so close to those other groups because they're messing up, you know, what the good of the country is. All right, and so everything all ties together. And then the whole separate but equal before 1954, that was done on purpose. That was purposely done to keep black people out of those opportunities, because a lot of these scientists already knew that, okay, really, intelligence is really about resources and opportunities. And so they knew that if black people were to get these resources and opportunities, they might just have the same thing that white people have. They might just actually climb that same ladder. We can't have that, so let's keep them in their separate but equal schools, which weren't really equal, which, as we all know. All right, and that's why we weren't allowed in the majority institutions as far as college and everything like that until after Brown versus Board education, things like that. Even something like No Child Left Behind. I always thought that was BS, because, of course, No Child Left Behind was a punitive program where if the schools were not meeting the standards, they lost funding. But the issue with funding is, where does funding come from when it comes to schools? Property taxes. All right, property taxes are what fund the different zones for where kids can go to school, and, you know, what the schools get. If a school district already doesn't have anything, clearly you need to invest in them so that they can have better teachers and better resources to teach the kids better. But instead it was like, no, oh, your school didn't do what it needed to do, we're going to pull funding. So if you already have a poor area, and an area that's considered a dropout factory, and there's no resources going into the school, of course the schools are not going to perform to the standard that's being held to a school in like the 95210 zip code. You know what I mean? And so as these schools continue to underperform, they would start losing funding. And then this is where you had the influx of teachers and stuff who were cheating and trying to rig the exams just so their students could pass. And just think, you had all those teachers in Atlanta who were all serving 10 and 20 years because they really just didn't want their kids to fail. That's pretty much what it led down to. And then you look at something like tuition. Tuition is something that's purposely done on purpose, because literally there's enough money for every student in this country to go to college for free. There's enough money for it. If we can spend $250 million every single day, and I'm serious, every single day, $250 million on war, we definitely have the money to make sure that every child in this country goes to college for free, at least for undergrad. But tuition is something that kind of helps to push the idea of college only being for elite individuals in this country. And the definition of elite at the time period that it was created was rich white people, not anybody else. All right, this also ties into things like the gifted program. All right, when you got into life after 1954, especially when they got into busing in the 70s, because listen, 1954 happened, people pretty much still stayed in their segregated schools. White people were not coming to the black schools, black people were not coming to the white. They had to start busing people to the different schools. White people got pissed off again, and they felt, oh my goodness, my kids are too intelligent for this, my kids are special. This is the emergence of the gifted program. And before you know it, everybody was gifted. Now, on the counter, this was also the emergence of the special ed program, and a lot of black individuals and black students were put into special ed, not because of intelligence, but because of behavioral problems. And you have to think, as these black kids were going to these white schools, culturally they didn't always relate with their teachers, and so when these kids would act up, oh my God, they have mental something, they're special ed. And so a lot of black kids have constantly been put into special ed programs that are not even special ed. I have a few kids that are in special ed, and I'm like, ain't nothing wrong with this child, why is this child in special ed? And there's nothing wrong with special ed, but special education pretty much is supposed to be a resource for people who actually have a disorder or a disability when it comes to learning. And so people who actually have something that they were born with that they actually can't help were now being categorized in the same boat as black individuals who may just not have been able to culturally relate to the teachers that were instructing them, and because the teachers felt that, oh my goodness, they have a problem, put them in special ed. All right, that's literally what happened. And it ties, because honestly, I'll give you my own experience. They definitely wanted me to repeat the 1st and the 5th grade, mainly because, one, the teacher felt my maturity level in 1st grade was not where it needed to be. She felt I needed to repeat my grade. And my mom was like, wait, he's 6. What maturity level do you expect him to have? He's not repeating anything. And really the experience that I had was because I went to 4 different elementary schools because my parents were military and we moved a lot. I just kept going into different school districts, and so the different standards were different in each district. And so I was kind of behind, but I wasn't slow. It was just, listen, y'all got 15 different ways of doing things, and then you go to one state and this is the standard, you go to another state and that's the standard. So when I finished 5th grade, I had just moved back to the United States from Italy through like the military school district Dodds, and where I was supposed to go to school in Savannah, Georgia. And Savannah was like, oh no, he's a little slow, we don't think he needs, he might need to repeat 5th grade. And my mom was like, you know what? And so no, she didn't buy that. She was like, no, you're gonna stay in the same grade you're in. And so you fast forward to my senior year, I definitely graduated like 16 out of 581, and it had nothing to do with, because they were like, one of the recommendations for my 1st grade, they wanted me to be in like a special ed program, and my mom and dad were like, hell no, ain't nothing wrong with our child, y'all can kick rocks. And so, but that's literally how it is. Like, a lot of black children are put into that same program. One of my best friends had that same exact experience. She went to school in Virginia. She tried to qualify for the gifted program. They told her she wasn't intelligent enough. They actually want her to actually go to special ed. Like, so there's a bunch of different things going on. And so when it comes to standardized testing, they've used that as a justification to continue to keep people down. And it goes back to what I said in the very beginning of this video. The idea of standardized testing was to keep social order. It was to keep certain people from reaching certain heights and keeping other people, you know, from having to associate and even be in the same space with people who weren't eligible to reach those certain heights. So I've said a lot. Hopefully I was able to get it all out and articulate it well. I'll be honest, it is 2:43 in the morning, so if I got some of the language a little messed up, it is what it is. I'm tired. But that's my 2 cents on standardized testing. I just don't like the idea of putting people in a box and expecting them to operate by the same standard, because like I said, everybody is so different. Everybody has so many different gifts and different ways that they do things. And so for us to be in this such so-called advanced country, for us to still be abiding by a racist policy, a racist exam, something that's purposely been proven to pretty much keep different groups of people down and under and elevate other groups of people, for that to still be the standard, that's a problem with me. And so unfortunately, there's not really much that's going to change, and it's kind of like you just have to figure it out and make it work. But it is what it is. And honestly, SAT it doesn't really, how do I say this? Again, it's not a full representation of anybody's intelligence. I remember SAT. I was that last generation that took the old SAT before they switched to the new one. So I took it my junior year and I got a 14 something on it. And then the new one had started. And when I was applying to Howard, Howard was like, okay, cool, but we want you to take the new one because that's the newer one. I took that new one. Mind you, writing is where I'm good. I did horrible. And so it was like, wait a minute, how do you get a 1400 on the old SAT, but then the new one, I don't even remember what I got, but it was like only like a 15 something. And I think the new one was out at like 2200 or 24, I can't remember. But I did terrible on it. And so, again, it just goes to show like everybody learns so differently, and you can't really sum up somebody's intellectual capabilities off of something as simple as an exam that somebody else created. You know what I mean? Anyway, that's it. I'm out. Share your 2 cents. If I pissed you off, it is what it is. I'm sorry. History has an ugly side. You just have to accept it and let it be. Anyway, I'm out.